Thanks. It's been an incredible event, hasn't it? We've got a great theme. Know better, do better. I think in a lot of ways, this theme is an apt motto for the complex and dynamic world that we live in. You know, increasingly, the problems we're facing are being described as wicked problems due to their complexity and how widespread they are. But think about the future. 25 years from now, I think if we're honest with ourselves, we really have no idea what kind of challenges we're going to face. And so we really need a diverse set of knowledge to be able to cope with the wicked problems of today and the uncertainty of tomorrow. The irony, though, is that in many ways we already do know better. We're just letting so much of that knowledge slip away. This is the island of Malekula in the South Pacific nation of Vanuatu. Vanuatu has the highest levels of cultural diversity per capita of anywhere on the planet, for now. Recently, a boat left this bay. It was carrying an old, sick man. I'll call him David. The seas were rough, it was dark, and the health clinic was far up the island. And unfortunately, the boat had left a little too late, and the old man was a little too sick. And so, a few hours later, the sound of the motor could be heard coming back across the bay. And soon the crying and the wailing spread across the sand and into the village. David had died. Now, those who loved and knew David grieved. But of course, you didn't know David. And 150,000 people die on this planet every day. So why should we mourn the loss of this one man, of David? Well, David was one of 3 remaining speakers of an Indigenous language. And now the 2 remaining speakers are also old, frail men. And when they pass away, so too will the language. For the children and the grandchildren of these men don't speak this language. And what's amazing about this story to me is that it's not unique. Collectively today, humans speak approximately 7,000 languages. But in the lifetime of my children, who today are 6 and 9 years old, as many as half of those languages will disappear, just like David's is about to. And I think this situation leaves us with 3 questions that we really need answers to. Why should we be worried about this loss of cultural diversity? Why is it happening? And what should we do about it? Before we answer the first of those questions, though, let's keep in mind that cultural diversity is more than just languages. And looking at these languages in detail gives us a little glimpse into that. Now, any of you who speak more than one language already have a feel for this, because you know that there are certain concepts, certain ideas, certain words that are next to impossible to accurately translate from one language to another. Why is that? Let's take an example. I had the privilege for many years to work and live in Aotearoa, more widely known as New Zealand. And the Maori people of Aotearoa speak Te Reo. And in Te Reo, there's a word, whenua. Whenua means placenta. It's the nourishment we get in the womb. It's our virtual lifeblood. But this same word, whenua, also means land. Now, it's next to impossible to do so, but I ask you for one moment to imagine that you grew up Maori. What would be your relationship to the land? Would it be different than your relationship is now? And when we think about this, we have to remember that this is one concept, one word. And if we take the totality of all the words, of the whole language, of the whole culture, well, then we begin to realize that when we're talking about cultural diversity, We're talking about thousands of different ways of seeing the world and our place in it. And these thousands of worldviews, they're the foundation of thousands of unique sets of knowledge. So let's get back to our first question. Why should we be worried about the loss of this cultural diversity? Well, I think first we need to realize that culture involves the rights of people. It's the rights of indigenous people to determine the future of their cultures. Rights that have too often been ignored and undermined. But let's be cynical for a moment. Because far too often, the policies of governments around the world have been cynical about the rights of indigenous people. And so let's ask a different question. What value does this cultural diversity have for the rest of humanity? And to do so, let's look at a disease that has plagued our species for thousands of years. In a certain light, it's beautiful. But malaria affects 200 million people a year. Now, the first widespread treatment of malaria was quinine. Quinine was developed from the bark of the cinchona tree by the indigenous people of Peru. And then, ignoring intellectual property rights, the British East India Company took quinine and spread it around the world. To do so, though, they had to realize that people didn't really like quinine. It was bitter. And so, they mixed quinine with something sweet. And voila, the gin and tonic. The tonic contains quinine. Go to the supermarket, it still does. And the gin, well, people like drinking that. And so quinine saved thousands of lives. Malaria did not enjoy this party. Malaria developed resistance. And so today, the most effective and increasingly widespread treatment for malaria is artemisinin. Artemisinin comes from a Chinese herbal medicine. Today, it's saving thousands of lives. Now, I ask you for a moment to imagine where we would be without the indigenous people of Peru, their worldviews, and quinine, or without the Chinese herbalists and their worldviews and artemisinin. Imagine if we just had the British. We'd have a whole lot of gin and no tonic. So, if we accept now that we're going to respect the rights of indigenous people, and that there's a value to cultural diversity for all of humanity, then our next question is, why are we losing this diversity? I think here, first we need to recognize that culture is not static. It's not something we can take and just put in a museum. Culture belongs to people. Culture is dynamic and changing. The other thing we need to recognize is that contact amongst different cultural groups, communication, Twitter, doesn't automatically lead to the loss of cultural diversity. About 15 years ago, I was in Peru. I was on a tributary of the Amazon River. And the sun was setting. And in front of me, there was a soccer field. There was a game going on. And there's a woman standing next to me. She had her pet parrot on her shoulder. And across the soccer field and above the tropical forest, the moon was rising. It's a beautiful scene. And the woman turned to me and she asked, "Does the moon shine in your land?" Whoa. Yes, I said, the moon does shine in the United States. And then she didn't pause. She immediately turned and said, "Do you know Monica Lewinsky?" Now, what's amazing about this story, I think, is that that woman spoke an indigenous language. She used indigenous science to manage her natural resources. By so many different measures, her culture wasn't necessarily threatened, even though she knew about Ms. Lewinsky. So if it's not contact between cultures that is driving the loss of cultural diversity, well, then what is? Here, I think we need to recognize that increasingly, fewer and fewer cultural groups, a small number of cultural groups, is determining the shape and fabric of society. These groups are determining the systems of law, of education, of economies, of natural resource management. And it is this imbalance of power that exists within society that is driving the loss of cultural diversity. I ask you to think back to David, back on Malakula. Not right before he died, but when he's raising his children. He's got a decision to make, and ultimately, the future of culture is about decisions, about choice. And he looks out at the systems around him, and he looks at the schools where he's going to send his kids. He looks at the markets where his family's going to find the goods that they desire, at the laws of the land. And he sees that all of these systems are shaped by other cultural groups, speaking other languages. And now David's going to base this decision on one main thing, the thing that all parents base their decisions on. He wants to ensure that his children have the best chance to survive and thrive. And so for this decision, David really doesn't have a freedom of choice when it comes to his culture. So what does he do? He leaves the culture behind. He leaves the language behind. And he sends his kids off into the society that's dominated by this other culture. And it's in this way, in this imbalance of power in the systems of our society, that we lose cultural diversity. So, our last question, what do we do about it? I think first and foremost, we need to realize how unlevel the playing field actually is, how imbalanced the power actually is in society. To do so, let's look at one system within society. Let's look at the school. And let's look at the schools where David was going to send his children. School there is taught in English. The textbooks, the examples in those textbooks are from some far-off land where David's children have never been and in all likelihood never will go. This same imbalance in power, imbalance in culture exists in our own schools. I'm lucky in that I get to volunteer in my kids' school. And not that long ago, I was in a kindergarten class. What you realize when you're in a kindergarten class is how amazing kindergarten teachers are. You know? They're incredibly creative, super dedicated, and these have to be some of the most patient human beings on the planet. Right? And importantly, we don't pay them nearly enough money. True. The other thing you realize is that the systems constrain these kindergarten teachers, even the very materials that they're provided. So I was sitting around a table, and there was a kid from Vietnam, and 2 kids from Libya, and a whole bunch of kids from Colorado. And we're learning about prepositions. You might remember these words: on, under, over, prepositions. Okay? Now they're in kindergarten, so they have 2 pictures, and they have to match the preposition to this pair of pictures. So there's a table, and there's a cat. The cat is under the table. And we go, learning our prepositions. And we get to this pair. And the girl from Colorado, she jumps up, over. The cow jumps over the moon. She's excited. She's got it, right? And those 2 kids from Libya over here with huge eyes. What? Right? I mean, imagine they go home that night, right? And they're around the dinner table, and they're saying, you know, Mom and Dad, we thought it was a little weird that people strap the boards on their feet and they go swooshing down the snowy slopes, but that's nothing. Here in the United States, cows jump over the moon. Because they were learning more than prepositions, weren't they? The lesson was embedded in culture. And that, in and of itself, is a good thing. The challenge we face is that the lessons in our schools here and all around the world are increasingly embedded in one culture. Everywhere, cows are jumping over the moon, an English nursery rhyme. So, what are we going to do? We can't be naive. We can't assume that we're going to evenly spread power and control of the systems of society equally across 7,000 different cultural groups. It's not going to happen. But we can take small steps. We can begin to level the playing field. And inspiration comes from where we started, back on Malakula in Vanuatu. The communities on this island decided to begin to level that playing field. And let's take an example, the schools. They talked to the heads of the schools and they said, look, we're going to give you 4 days a week, but we're taking 1 day back. And they used Indigenous architecture and they built a building. And 1 day a week, the kids go to that building and they learn from the elders of that community in their Indigenous language about the skills they need to live in that community. And just as importantly, they learn to be proud of who they are, to be proud of their culture, to be proud of their language. And these communities argue, and I wholeheartedly agree, that those kids are going to be better prepared. Because now they're able to draw from the worldview and the knowledge base that has been developed across generations in that place. And they're also able to draw from the worldview and the knowledge systems that come down from the conventional school system. And so those kids become better prepared to deal with the wicked problems of today and the uncertainty of tomorrow. So I think we have answers to our 3 key questions. We absolutely need to be worried about the loss of cultural diversity. We need to respect and uphold the rights of Indigenous people. And we need to recognize the value that cultural diversity has for all of humanity. But to face this challenge, we must also realize how unevenly power is spread across our societies. And we must take these examples from Vanuatu and elsewhere, and we must begin to create systems which celebrate cultural diversity, which explore our differences, and which embrace multiple ways of thinking. And if we can do that, we'll be better prepared for tomorrow. But if we don't do that now, if we don't do that, then our grandchildren are going to grow up in a world that is far less diverse, and they won't even know it. Know better, do better. Thank you.